Good morning, Professor Spooner. How are you?
Good morning, Frank. It's nice to see you again.
Indeed.
While you've been away, globalization has been progressing faster and faster, and there's all sorts of things going on that show us that it's happening. For example, the death of Kofi Annan that was announced today is an example of something that if 50 years ago, Kofi Annan wouldn't have become Secretary General of the United Nations, but at the end of the century he did. And then yesterday, the death of Aretha Franklin, which in fact, even though I was a great fan of Aretha Franklin in the late 60s and 70s, I had no idea that she was so well known internationally and so popular internationally until I began to read all the news yesterday and today. So those are two things. And then secondly, the news this week, probably the news that most people have been reading this past week is the scandal in the Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. Strangely, that it's in the state of Pennsylvania more than anywhere else. And this is something which I'm sure has been going on for centuries. It's not that something that is only just beginning to happen, or even in the last, I mean, they say now that it's been going on for a number of years, but they're talking in terms of decades, not centuries. Mm-hmm. But now we're talking about it. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the interesting thing about the way human society works is that human societies in small groups live according to a very strict set of cultural rules, and they don't break those rules. And the larger the society becomes, the more easy it is for there to be disagreement. And for people to be doing things, some people will be doing things that other people don't agree with, and then the first thing to do is to cover it up. So this is all part of a stage of globalization, and of course it's coming at a time when everything that has to do with sex and gender has been changing, and it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen to even the institution of marriage by the end of this century, because it's certainly not what it used to be, and not what I was brought up to think of it as. And I now have two cousins who have perfectly happy family lives who don't see the point of getting married. Mm-hmm. Both in England, of course, which I think Europe is socially more, what shall I say, the rate of social change in Europe has been ahead of the rate of social change in America, strangely. So I think these things are all very interesting indications of the way globalization is affecting our lives. And we don't think of it as globalization, but the quality of human life is definitely changing. But the biggest problem that is coming to our attention is, again, something we've talked about before, organization. Mm. I mean, democracy was, the idea was developed, I suppose, in the 5th century BCE in the city-state of ancient Greece, when all male citizens, not females, but all male citizens would go to the assembly and they'd work out what to do. Mm-hmm. It worked very well in a small society. When the idea began to be developed in the Western world, starting, I suppose, at the end of the 17th century, more in the 18th century, it took a long time for in any country for people to work out how to make it work in the modern world. because the societies were so much larger. Still in the middle of the 20th century in America, and I think it's true in Europe as well, the more influential and higher status people in the society were very much better informed about the political process and making the political decisions, and the people who were not so well educated and not so well informed were paying attention to what the more informed people were telling them about the political options, and to the extent that they were voting, and I'm afraid I don't know offhand now what the voting rate was at that time, so that quite well-informed political decisions were democratically successful. But now everybody is aware of the international situation and where they stand in their country and in the world, though they may not be well educated and not well informed about what we would consider important political details. And so the people like our current president in this country, and Erdogan in Turkey, and Putin in Russia, and similar political figures in other countries, are getting a lot of support from the people at the lower end of the social scale, that the people at the upper end of the social scale have to pay attention to and have to recognize, but the decisions are very different from what they would make.
Right, right.
So one wonders where this is all going to lead. I mean, it's already led in China to the one person at the top becoming, what shall I say, he's not going to have to be democratically elected again. Mm-hmm. And China has been much more democratic over the last 50 years than it gets credit for. That is, there's been a lot of popular participation in the decisions that the party has made. Russia has never been very democratic because it's such an enormous country with 11 time zones, and it's only the people in the European part and small pockets in other parts that are really involved in any political decisions. But once again, Putin is able to stay there continuously. And Trump won't be able to do that, we hope. But it's very interesting the amount of discussion there's been in the media about what's going to happen in the midterm elections in November.
Well, it's interesting that you went through that review, because it struck me. We just returned from a vacation out in the woods in Yosemite, California. And for 9 days, our world consisted of a total of 11 different people, including myself. It was a very small tribe. It was globalization on the other end than what we normally talk about. And everybody, indeed, by the second or third night around the campfire, knew their place in the structure. The day would go by where you would be hiking your 10 or 12 miles a day. And if you were lucky, you would encounter 2 or 3 other hikers passing you in the other direction. And invariably, you would stop, even though you'd be carrying heavy backpacks or you'd be climbing a large hill. And you'd stop and you'd talk to them for a minute or two. And I never failed to be struck by some imaginatory scenario in my mind of 1,000 years earlier, of medieval travelers traveling between villages in Europe, stopping on the road, talking to each other. How are things in your village? How are things in your town? That sort of thing. And that's what we were doing. How long have you been out in the woods? What was going on before you left? Do you know of any news about the location of the wildfires? That sort of thing. And then at night, the 11 people would assemble around the campfire and just talk. And it was it was it was interesting to me because for a week or so, my world was reduced to that very small unit without any contact with the outside world. And then, of course, once you come back on the grid and you get your cell phone and you begin to get plugged in again and you read your hundreds of email messages and you review the news and you become part of this gigantic digital whole, WHOLE. It sort of gave me two feelings. It gave me a feeling of relief that I was plugged back into the greater whole, but on the other hand, I missed the intimacy of that small group. And so it gave me an insight into what we always talk about how globalization, yes, the institutions have difficulty keeping up with it, but it also, the speed of globalization also can cause problems for the individual because the individual can miss out on that intimacy that he or she would receive in a much smaller unit. And if he or she is reliant upon the greater digital good, if you will, they're often not going to get what they need out of that. And
you're absolutely right. The relationships are changing because if you have relationships with a dozen people, you know those people in a very different way from the situation where you have relationships with thousands of people on Facebook. And it's interesting that you had this experience in the last week or so, and it reminded me of my experience in Iran when I was living with pastoral nomads who, and as part of the time, and this was in the 60s and 70s, when they really hadn't been affected by globalization at all at that time. So most of the time I would be with particular camps of nomads, but then sometimes I would be moving between camps, and then sometimes I would simply be walking on my own because I knew the way, and I'd meet other people who were walking on their own, and there was a particular way that you met people. Went through a sort of ritual of meeting. And this sort of thing, there's this enormous expanse in the world through Central Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa, where, unlike any other part of the world, a significant proportion of the population is nomadic and pastoral, which up until very recently was completely separate from the settled and urbanizing population, and that is now changing. So that the way the quality of everyday life is changing in that part of the world is something that's much more, what shall I say, comprehensive and faster than anywhere else. And this is the sort of thing that causes problems.
Yes.
Because it affects some people at different rates from the way it affects other people, and people at different stages of the progress of this sort of social change get into conflict with each other. And this is a large part of the current problems in the Middle East, and there are similar things in other parts of the world. It's the unevenness of the rate of social change, which most of us in the West are not aware of.
So that's interesting, because if you look at and try to identify the remaining pockets of the people who are lagging behind, if you will, in adapting to the new technology that's permitting the increasing globalization, you could probably draw circles around them as potential trouble spots as you just suggest, because that's where the unevenness is. If it's along that Silk Road route, if you will, in Central Asia, if it's in parts of Africa, if it's in parts of the Middle East, if it might be in parts of Latin America, for example, this is where the biggest jump is going to have to occur over the next 10 or 15 years. And there's definitely going to be a lot of cultural bumping going on, I suspect.
Yes. So the other thing that probably we should mention before we finish today is the whether or not we are suffering from climate change, because the news in the last week or so has been full of the fires in California and other parts of the world, and especially Japan. And Japan is particularly interesting because of the rate of social change in Japan that has been accelerating since the middle of the 19th century. Mm. And now Japan is ahead of every other part of the world in terms of longevity.
Right. Yeah.
So now they reckon there are 60,000 people in Japan over the age of 100.
It's rather amazing, isn't it? Yes. Yeah.
And at the same time, the fertility rate is declining.
Yeah, they're going to have a big worker problem very shortly.
So this gives us another window onto the way human life is changing, in that the world used to be in the hands of people in a particular age bracket, which was what I suppose we now call upper middle age. And now an increasing number of people who are really important in government and decision making are older. Mm-hmm. And there's a bigger, there's much more discussion going on between people at different ages with different sorts of experience of life. So there's this sort of social problem, as well as the larger democratic type of social problem.
That's an interesting observation. I mean, in addition to the larger democratic type of problem, we do have this discourse that by default, as a result of changing conditions, has 70 and 80-year-old people forced to interact with 20 and 30-year-old people, and vice versa, for the greater common good. Because if they can't interact, then collective decisions can't be made adequately. And I don't think that's ever happened before in the history of the world. And very interesting as usual, Professor. It's amazing what one misses when one is out in the woods. I'll look forward to speaking next week. So,
okay.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Bye.
All right.